Ever contemplated how broken modern sleep feels? We possess superior mattresses, tranquil bedrooms, and abundant guidance, yet individuals still awaken feeling fatigued. Medieval communities practiced what historians now refer to as biphasic sleep. They slept in two distinct phases. Upon the onset of darkness, they would settle in for their first sleep, lasting approximately 4 hours. Subsequently, they would awaken for about 2 hours before returning to their second sleep until dawn. During these midnight hours, medieval households exhibited subtle signs of life. Couples might share stories while monastic records detail monks utilizing this time for profound prayer and contemplation. Some individuals composed letters by candlelight, others engaged in crafts, and many simply sat in quiet conversation. These periods were not considered interruptions to their sleep. They were integral components of their daily rhythm. The original burning the midnight oil was not a result of procrastination. It was a deliberate part of the plan all along. The midnight hours also served practical purposes within medieval communities. Town records indicate that craftsmen often utilized this time to monitor their kilns or attend to dishes requiring slow cooking processes. Bakers would begin preparing their dough, leveraging the optimal fermentation time between sleep cycles. Even in affluent households, these hours had their uses, with ladies employing the time to catch up on embroidery away from the day's demands. The original me time occurred while everyone else was slumbering through their first sleep. What makes this sleep pattern particularly fascinating is its apparent natural alignment with human physiology. When researchers in the 1990s conducted experiments involving individuals living without artificial light for several weeks, participants naturally adopted the same two-phase sleep pattern. Their bodies spontaneously adjusted to what medieval people had intuitively understood all along. This was the natural rhythm of human rest. It turns out our ancestors weren't sleep-deprived. They were simply sleepwise. The practice left its imprint on medieval literature as well. The Canterbury Tales features characters rising between sleeps for various endeavors, while household guides from the era offered specific recommendations for suitable midnight activities. Some even suggested that thoughts and conversations during these hours held particular significance, as the mind was in its clearest state. Medieval productivity enthusiasts would have found this period of untapped time highly appealing. Medical texts from the period indicate that doctors considered this midnight wakefulness beneficial for health. They believed it aided everything from digestion to mental clarity. One physician wrote that dreams from the first sleep could reveal illnesses, while the period between sleeps was ideal for contemplating their meaning. Another recommended gentle stretching during this time, although he specifically advised against vigorous sword practice. Apparently, some enthusiastic knights required this reminder. The original "don't exercise before bedtime" warning. Archaeological evidence from medieval homes across Europe reveals how widespread this practice was. Excavations have uncovered dedicated sitting nooks and alcoves in common houses specifically designed for these midnight activities. Special holders for rushlights, long-burning, slender candles ideal for midnight reading or crafting, have been found in homes of all social classes, suggesting this wasn't limited to the wealthy. The original cozy reading corner wasn't necessarily by the fireplace. It was wherever you found yourself settled at 2 a.m. A collection of letters from a French noblewoman in 1465 describes her use of this time for writing poetry, claiming the silence between sleeps brought her the clearest inspiration. A merchant's records show meticulous accounting performed during these hours, noting that his mind was sharpest for numbers in the midnight quiet. Medieval insomniacs weren't counting sheep, they were counting actual money. The most compelling accounts come from medieval hospitals, where nurses' logs regularly mention patients being most talkative and clear-minded during their midnight waking period. They utilized this time for administering certain medicines and recording symptoms, believing that observations made between sleeps were particularly reliable. The original hospital rounds occurred when modern doctors would likely be resting in the break room. For medieval individuals, this nighttime waking wasn't merely about being awake. It was about experiencing a distinct state of consciousness they referred to as the watching hour. They believed this time possessed special qualities. Prayers were more likely to be answered, creative thoughts flowed more freely, and conversations reached deeper meanings. While we might view their beliefs as superstitious modern sleep studies have shown that this period between sleep phases often produces a distinct state of relaxed alertness, ideal for contemplation and gentle activity. The original mindfulness practice didn't require an application. Individuals could recall with remarkable accuracy what they were doing during these hours, as it was such a distinct and valued part of their day. Several medieval towns record instances where alibis involving activities performed between sleeps were taken particularly seriously, as this was considered a time of heightened awareness and reliable memory. The original "I have a perfect alibi" wasn't about being at a party, it was about embroidering by candlelight. The remarkable aspect of this medieval sleep pattern wasn't solely its existence, but how it fostered a dedicated time for reflection and connection that our contemporary world has largely lost. The medieval night was intensely, unequivocally dark. Streetlights were absent, as were glowing screens, and even moonlight was often minimal in densely populated urban areas, where tall buildings obstructed the sky. The only sources of light were fires, candles, and oil lamps, and these were not used casually. A single candle could cost an average worker a day's wages, making artificial light a luxury sparingly used by most. Even affluent merchants typically owned only 3 or 4 candles at a time. They were so valuable that some medieval wills specifically mentioned the inheritance of partially used candles. One particularly amusing case from York details a family dispute over a half-burnt beeswax candle of considerable size. Apparently, even medieval inheritance disputes had their points of light. Without artificial light extending their days, people's sleep patterns naturally synchronized with sunset and sunrise. The human body produces melatonin, our sleep hormone, when it gets dark. Medieval individuals received a pure, undiluted dose of this natural sleep regulator every single night. Their bodies were not confused by the blue light emitted from screens, which can suppress melatonin production by up to 85%, according to recent studies. Medieval medical texts indicate that doctors understood the connection between darkness and sound sleep, even without knowing about melatonin. They advised patients with sleep difficulties to ensure their sleeping chambers were as dark as possible. One physician wrote that, "Sleep comes best to those who embrace the darkness like a warm blanket." Poetic and scientifically accurate, even if he didn't understand the underlying biological mechanism. Darkness shaped medieval society in intriguing ways. Towns enforced strict curfews, not solely for safety, but because activities requiring visual precision simply couldn't be performed after dark. Workers engaged in detailed crafts like embroidery or manuscript illumination were prohibited from working after sunset to prevent eye strain and maintain quality. Darkness also impacted commerce. Many towns had specific darkness prices for certain goods. Items cost more if purchased after sunset simply due to the additional candles required to conduct business. Some merchants specialized in night trade, charging premium prices for emergency supplies after dark. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of medieval darkness was the way people adapted to it. They developed an entire sensory world that modern humans have largely lost. Individuals could identify others by their footsteps, distinguish different animals in complete darkness, and navigate familiar spaces relying solely on touch and sound. In the 15th century, night watchmen described being able to discern the time of night by the sounds of various insects and birds. Darkness even influenced architecture. Medieval builders designed homes with ingenious light wells and strategically positioned windows to maximize natural light during the day. They used light-colored plaster on interior walls to reflect and amplify the limited available light. Some wealthy homes featured special niches called light cups, curved recesses designed to help reflect and amplify the light from a single candle. Medieval monasteries took darkness particularly seriously. Monastic records detail elaborate systems for ensuring darkness in dormitories. As the gentle darkness of medieval nights gave way to our artificially lit world, we lost something profound: the experience of true natural darkness and its benefits for sleep. Yet another element of medieval sleep worked in tandem with this darkness to create ideal sleeping conditions. Privacy in medieval times held a meaning completely different from today's understanding. While the idea of sharing one's bed with strangers might seem off-putting now, medieval people viewed it as entirely normal. In fact, bed sharing was not merely common, it was expected, practical, and in some instances, even legally mandated. There is a record of an innkeeper in York being fined for providing travelers with separate beds when his inn wasn't full. The magistrate's ruling stated that it was against custom and wastes good firewood to heat multiple chambers when guests can share warmth. Medieval hospitality literally meant togetherness, whether desired or not. Talk about mandatory cuddling. One merchant complained about being paired with a most vigorous snorer who could wake the dead, though the innkeeper's response was simply to charge him extra for having the bed to himself, the first noise cancellation fee in history. The practical advantages of bed sharing extended beyond merely staying warm. Medieval houses were not heated like modern homes. Most rooms lacked any heat source. The primary source of warmth came from shared body heat, and people developed sophisticated methods for maximizing it. Household guides from the period described the ideal arrangement of sleepers, with the youngest, who generated the most body heat, placed in the middle. Children effectively served as medieval hot water bottles. Monasteries had particularly well-documented sleeping arrangements. Their dormitory records show monks sleeping 2 or 3 to a bed, with strict rules for maintaining proper distance and indignity. One monastery's regulations included a fine for excessive nocturnal wandering, presumably for monks who couldn't stay as still in their sleep. This communal sleeping environment had interesting social effects. Conversations and agreements were made within the bed fellowship, suggesting these shared sleeping spaces were also important for social bonding and business discussions. In 1458, a legal decision was based on testimony from someone who overheard a crucial conversation while sharing a bed at an inn. The original listening device was simply another person under the covers. Children's sleeping arrangements were particularly communal. Rather than having individual rooms, children typically slept in large groups, often in the same bed. This practice was believed to aid everything from warmth to character development. Medieval parenting guides suggested that children who slept alone might become selfish or fearful. Nothing builds character like being kicked by 6 siblings all night long. The practice was not without its challenges. Numerous complaints about bed sharing gone wrong range from stolen blankets to midnight kicks. There's a record of a merchant suing an inn because his bed partner sang sea shanties in his sleep with such vigor that no rest could be had. The first documented case of sleep singing disorder. Some inns developed creative solutions to common bed sharing problems. Some established snorers' chambers, special rooms for particularly loud sleepers. Others had systems for matching travelers based on their sleeping habits, a sort of medieval roommate matching service. Sir, according to our records, you're a blanket tugger, so we've paired you with a heat radiator who doesn't mind. Guild records reveal that some professions had specific bed-sharing customs. Bakers who needed to rise very early were often paired together in inns. One baker noted that members should seek the company of their own trade in sleep, lest the early riser disturb the late sleeper's rest. The Baker Brotherhood united in dough and dozing. The practice of bed sharing also influenced architecture. Many medieval homes were built with large shared sleeping chambers rather than individual bedrooms. These rooms often featured multiple fireplaces and carefully planned ventilation systems to ensure fresh air for many sleepers. Architectural records from the period show that wealthy merchants' homes typically contained one large sleeping chamber instead of several smaller ones. Ever had a difficult day and thought it couldn't get any worse? Well, medieval peasants would like a word with you. Back when kings reigned and dragons filled storybooks, ordinary people lived lives so harsh and demanding that they'd make your worst day seem like a luxury vacation. Because imagine living in a time when approximately 90% of the population lacked basic amenities we take for granted today. No electricity, no running water, and definitely no takeout delivery when you're too tired to cook. It was just you, your family, and whatever you could manage to cultivate or trade for. These individuals were likely more physically resilient than any contemporary fitness enthusiast. While we meticulously track steps on our fitness trackers, they were engaged in a completely natural, full-body workout every day, whether they desired it or not. And trust me, there was no protein shake awaiting them after their exertion. Yet despite experiencing what we would consider a considerably challenging existence, medieval peasants weren't passive in their suffering. They devised their own forms of amusement, built strong community bonds, and likely enjoyed better social lives than some of us today who spend our evenings scrolling through social media. I mean, when was the last time your entire neighborhood gathered for a communal feast? And no, ordering from the same delivery app doesn't count. Life was not easy, but these individuals were incredibly resourceful. They had to be. When living in a world without convenience stores or online shopping, you learn to make do with what you have. It was like extreme survival mode, but instead of lasting a few days as in those TV shows, this was their entire life. Now that we've established how tough the life of medieval peasants was, let me tell you about their actual labor. And indeed, they worked extensively. The day began before sunrise. In winter, this might mean rising around 7 a.m., but in summer, we're talking about 4 a.m. wake-up calls. You might think your morning alarm is harsh, but a medieval peasant's work schedule would make today's most demanding jobs seem like leisure. They didn't just perform one job, they had to be farmers, carpenters, shepherds, and blacksmiths all rolled into one. You know the saying, jack of all trades? Well, these individuals embodied it because if they didn't know how to do something, they had to learn rapidly or go hungry. The farming year was divided into specific tasks that had to be done at precisely the right time. Spring meant plowing, and this wasn't about sitting comfortably in an air-conditioned tractor. 2 oxen pulled a heavy wooden plow, requiring the peasant to exert considerable strength to keep it straight and at the correct depth. Fun fact, it took approximately 8 oxen to plow 1 acre of heavy soil in a day. If you lost an ox, you were in serious trouble. Kind of like losing your car and your job simultaneously. Summer presented its own challenges. From sunrise to sunset, peasants were out in the fields weeding. A single patch of weeds could ruin an entire crop. They lacked modern herbicides, relying solely on their hands and perhaps a simple tool. Every single weed had to be removed manually. My back aches just thinking about it. And let's not forget the constant battle with pests. Without pesticides, creative solutions were necessary. Some peasants would actually hire children to run through the fields making noise to scare away birds. This was likely the medieval equivalent of a summer job. But instead of preparing fast food, you were actively yelling at crows. However, medieval peasants actually developed many farming techniques still in use today. They understood crop rotation long before scientists could explain its benefits. They would plant wheat one year, followed by barley, then leave the field fallow to allow it to recover. It's as if they were the original agricultural scientists, just without the lab coats and clipboards. Fall was harvest time, and this period was truly intense. Every able-bodied person in the village would be in the fields, racing against the clock and the weather to bring in the crops. They used sickles to cut the grain, essentially a curved blade that had to be swung just right to avoid inflicting more cuts than harvested wheat. Studies show that a skilled harvester could cut about an acre of wheat in a day, but this involved making approximately 15,000 individual cuts. Talk about repetitive strain injury. Archaeological evidence indicates that most medieval peasants had arthritis by their mid-30s. It's no wonder, as they were essentially performing strenuous physical labor from the age of 6. Winter wasn't exactly a period of idleness either. This season was dedicated to repairing everything that had broken during the year: tools, buildings, fences. However, something that might surprise you is that medieval peasants actually had more vacation days than most of us do now. The church enforced numerous holy days when work was prohibited. Some historians estimate they had around 150 days off per year. The ingenious aspect of medieval work was its communal nature. Everyone pitched in during busy periods, and they developed a complex system of mutual aid. If your neighbor's ox died, you would lend them yours, knowing they would do the same for you. It was like an early version of social security, but with more manure and less paperwork. Recent studies of medieval village records reveal the remarkable effectiveness of these informal support networks. Villages that practiced strong cooperation were more likely to survive famines and economic hardships. And let's not overlook the specialized skills many peasants developed. Some became experts at specific crafts such as beekeeping, brewing, or blacksmithing. These were not mere hobbies, they were essential services that could determine whether one had enough to trade for necessities or went without. It's estimated that a skilled medieval blacksmith could produce up to 100 nails in a day, which doesn't sound impressive until you consider that each one was crafted by hand. After all this back-breaking labor, you would assume these individuals would at least get to enjoy a substantial meal. Well, about that, the average medieval peasant consumed around 2,000 to 3,000 calories per day, which sounds reasonably good until you realize they were essentially performing strenuous physical activity from dawn till dusk. Bread was their primary food source. We are talking about 2 to 3 pounds of bread consumed daily. However, this was not your refined artisanal sourdough. Medieval bread often contained fragments of sand and grit from the millstones used to grind the grain. Over time, this would actually wear down their teeth. Talk about a real reason to need a dentist. The most common beverage was something called small beer. It was a weak, low-alcohol beer that everyone, including children, drank instead of water. Why? Because the water was often contaminated and the brewing process made the beer safer to drink. That's right, in medieval times, beer was literally safer than water. Finally, a historical fact you can use to justify your drinking habits. The medieval diet adhered to a strict hierarchy. The best cuts of meat were reserved for the nobles, while peasants received what remained, typically the parts we today discard or feed to pets. They ate copious amounts of pottage, a thick soup made from peas, beans, and whatever vegetables were available. It was essentially the medieval version of throw everything in a pot and hope for the best. Sometimes it was so thick you could stand your spoon in it. Medieval peasants would consume this pottage for days, sometimes weeks, adding new ingredients as they obtained them. It was like the world's longest-running leftover scenario. During periods of good fortune, peasants might have bacon or salt pork. Fresh meat was rare, perhaps available only a few times a year during festivals. Can you imagine anticipating all year just to have one decent piece of meat? It's like waiting for a major sale, except instead of getting a new television, you're hoping for a piece of chicken. When they did acquire meat, they utilized absolutely every part, from the snout to the tail. They even had a saying, "You use everything but the squeal." It sounds like they originated the zero-waste movement. Medieval peasants were actually quite ingenious when it came to food preservation. They had to be. One poor harvest could mean starvation. They developed remarkable techniques for smoking, salting, and fermenting food. During famines, which occurred approximately once every generation, conditions became truly desperate. Historical records document people resorting to eating bark, clay, and even leather shoes. There's a record from the Great Famine of 1317 where individuals were caught stealing unbaked dough from bakeries because they couldn't wait for it to cook. Now that is extreme hunger. Researchers estimate that during severe famines, up to 15% of the population could perish. These weren't just statistics. These were real people making impossible choices about survival. The church complicated matters further by declaring certain days as fish days when meat was prohibited. However, since most peasants live far from the coast, their fish might include beaver tail or barnacle geese, because apparently medieval religious authorities decided these qualified as fish. I suppose if you squint really hard and use your imagination. This led to some rather creative interpretations of animal classification. There were actual scholarly debates about whether barnacle geese grew on trees. Spoiler alert, they don't. Speaking of religious influence on diet, the medieval calendar was filled with fasting days, up to 150 per year. On these days, only one meal was permitted and animal products were often forbidden. However, medieval people became inventive with the rules. They made almond milk to replace dairy and created elaborate mock eggs from ground almonds and spices. They were essentially pioneering medieval vegan alternatives. Some of these recipes have survived, and modern food historians say they are actually quite tasty, though perhaps not worth the effort of grinding hundreds of almonds by hand. Analysis of medieval bones indicates that peasant children often experienced growth cessation for several years during famines. When food became available again, they would resume growing. Their bones literally tell the story of times of plenty and times of scarcity. Scientists can observe these growth arrests in the bones, similar to tree rings. Recent studies suggest that medieval peasants were several inches shorter than we are today, largely due to childhood malnutrition and relentless hard work. On the rare occasions when food was plentiful, medieval peasants truly knew how to celebrate. Harvest festivals could last for days, with everyone contributing whatever food they could spare. It was like a communal potluck dinner party, except everyone was profoundly grateful for the food. These feast days were infrequent, bright spots in an otherwise demanding dietary existence. After a long day of work and consuming their pottage, let's discuss what these individuals called home. And trust me, it was far from luxurious housing material. In medieval times, the concept of home sweet home took on a profoundly different significance. Have you ever heard someone complain about their one-bedroom apartment being too small? Medieval peasants would find that quite amusing. Their homes made modern tiny houses look like opulent mansions. The average peasant house was approximately 400 square feet, smaller than most contemporary two-car garages. And remarkably, the entire family resided there, often sharing the space with their chickens and other small animals. Talk about an early version of a petting zoo. The construction of these houses was, to say the least, interesting. Most were built using a technique called wattle and daub. Wattle involved weaving together sticks like a giant basket, and daub was a mixture of mud, straw, and animal manure applied over the wattle. When it dried, it became surprisingly strong. Recent archaeological experiments have shown that these walls could last up to 50 years if properly maintained. Not bad for mud and animal waste. And the best part? If a wall started to crumble, you could just apply more daub. It was like medieval spackle. Approximately 90% of peasant houses had dirt floors. Fresh rushes were spread on the floor, and herbs were added to improve the smell. These rushes would remain for months, accumulating food scraps, dirt, and who knows what else. When they became too unpleasant, a new layer was simply added on top. It was like having a compost pile right in your living room. Some archaeologists have discovered layers of medieval house floors up to 6 inches deep, each layer providing insights into the family's diet and lifestyle. The roof was typically thatched with straw, sometimes up to 2 feet thick. This was quite effective at keeping out rain, but also served as a favored habitat for rats, mice, and insects. Medieval peasants essentially had an entire ecosystem residing above their heads. Smoke from their fires had to escape through the thatch, as chimneys were a luxury most could not afford. This did, however, offer one benefit. The smoke helped preserve the thatch and deter some insects. Modern scientists have found that this smoke treatment actually created a natural insecticide that extended the thatch's lifespan. Windows? More like ventilation holes. Most peasant houses lacked glass windows, as glass was prohibitively expensive. Instead, they used wooden shutters or oiled parchment to keep out the weather. During winter, they would stuff the openings with straw or old clothing. Light was provided by rushlights, dried reeds dipped in animal fat. These emitted about as much light as a birthday candle, meaning that after dark, retiring to bed was essentially the only option. Recent experiments by historians indicate that a typical medieval house at night had roughly 1/100th the light level of a modern home. Furniture was minimal. Most families owned a table, perhaps a few benches, and a chest for storing their limited possessions. Beds? Those were a luxury. Most people slept on straw-filled mattresses directly on the floor. One of the most fascinating discoveries from archaeological excavations is the midden, a term for the medieval garbage dump. Every house had one, typically located just outside the door. Scientists have found everything from broken pottery to animal bones and lost coins in these middens. They serve as medieval time capsules. One archaeologist discovered a perfectly preserved pair of medieval wooden clogs in a midden, revealing that medieval footwear wasn't entirely different from some contemporary trendy shoes. The arrangement of peasant villages was quite intelligent. Houses were usually built close together, fostering a strong sense of community. Most villages had a central green where animals could graze and children could play. Recent studies of village layouts indicate they were often designed to maximize sunlight exposure and minimize wind impact. These communities demonstrated considerable understanding of energy efficiency. Archaeological surveys have shown that many villages were constructed on slight slopes, with carefully planned drainage channels to prevent flooding, medieval urban planning at its finest. However, living in such close proximity meant everyone was aware of everyone else's affairs. Privacy was not a medieval concept. You could likely overhear your neighbor's entire argument about whose turn it was to clean the communal pig pen. Speaking of shared facilities, many villages had communal baking ovens and animal pens. Contemporary court records are filled with amusing disputes between neighbors over everything from wandering chickens to overhanging tree branches. Some things truly never change. And let's discuss home maintenance. It was a perpetual task. Thatched roofs required regular repair, daub walls needed patching, and the issue of odor was constant. However, most repairs were communal events. When someone's roof needed fixing, the entire village would pitch in. It was like a medieval barn raising, complete with shared food and drink to celebrate the completion of the work. With houses being what they were, it's no wonder people spent so much time outdoors. But venturing outside meant navigating a completely different world of rules and laws. Regulations that would make today's most complex HOA agreement seem simple. The feudal system was more than just complex. It resembled a bizarre game of Simon Says. where Simon was your local lord and failing to follow his directives could cost you far more than just being out. Let's start with the basics. Medieval peasants were essentially born into a mandatory subscription service they couldn't cancel. From birth, they owed their local lord a portion of everything they produced. And this wasn't a small share. Records show peasants had to surrender up to 50% of their crops to their lord. It was like having an incredibly demanding roommate who doesn't actually live with you, but still consumes half your food. Some manors even required peasants to give their lord the first loaf of bread, baked. Talk about claiming the best slice for yourself. Contemporary court records provide some remarkable anecdotes. One peasant was fined for collecting an excessive amount of firewood. Apparently, staying too warm was prohibited. Another faced trouble for killing a rabbit on his own land, as all wild animals technically belong to the lord. Even fish in streams were off limits. Medieval lords were akin to the child in school who declared ownership of everything. That's mine, and oh yes, that's definitely mine too. Speaking of regulations, peasants weren't free to relocate whenever they wished. They were literally tied to the land, a condition known as being bound to the soil. If you desired to leave your village, you required permission from your lord. Some medieval records indicate peasants had to pay a fee merely to marry someone from another village. Talk about an expensive dating scene. One record from 1293 shows a peasant compelled to pay his lord 2 chickens simply for permission to allow his daughter to marry someone from the adjacent village. The manor court was the venue for all local disputes. These were not formal modern courtrooms. Proceedings were often held outdoors or in the manor house's great hall. The lord or his steward presided over judgments on everything from property disagreements to minor offenses. One court record from 1320 details a man being fined for making excessive noise while brewing beer. Apparently, medieval noise complaints were already a concern. Another record shows someone fined for spreading gossip. Medieval defamation law in action. However, peasants did possess some legal entitlements, albeit quite basic. They could bring cases before the manor court, and records show they frequently won. Studies of medieval court records have found that approximately 40% of cases brought by peasants against their social superiors were successful, not insignificant for a system inherently favoring the powerful. Court records also reveal that women could and did bring cases to court, constituting about 15% of all plaintiffs in certain areas. The system of punishment was remarkably creative. Minor offenses might result in a fine, but more serious ones could lead to placement in the stocks, essentially a medieval form of public shaming. Imagine being confined in a wooden frame in the village square while your neighbors hurled rotten vegetables at you. Some villages even had a ducking stool for punishing troublesome individuals. It was like a medieval dunk tank, albeit considerably less enjoyable and typically reserved for women accused of being scolds. Archaeological evidence suggests some of these punishment devices were quite sophisticated in their construction. Speaking of questionable legal practices, it's probably timely to discuss medieval medicine and healthcare. And trust me, you'll wish you had today's healthcare system after hearing this. If you dislike visiting the doctor now, you would have found being sick in medieval times quite agreeable. Their medical knowledge was a strange blend of superstition, guesswork, and practices that sound like something from a Halloween prank gone wrong. Medieval doctors were quite fond of blood, specifically getting it out of you. Have a headache? Let's drain some blood. Stomachache? More bloodletting. Stubbed your toe? You guessed it, time to deploy the leeches. These doctors believed all illnesses stemmed from an excess of certain bodily fluids, and bloodletting was their preferred method for restoring balance. One medical text recommended removing up to 1.5 liters of blood at a time, equivalent to 3 blood donations at once. Records show some individuals underwent bloodletting monthly to maintain health. However, peasants rarely had access to these qualified doctors. Instead, they relied on local healers and herbalists. These individuals actually possessed considerable knowledge of plants. Recent studies have shown that approximately 80% of medieval herbal remedies had genuine medicinal properties. The other 20%? Well, let's just say eating powdered owl brain probably didn't cure your insomnia as claimed. One medieval medical book recommended curing baldness by rubbing your head with chicken poop, a treatment that thankfully didn't survive into modern times. Some of their cures were creative. Got a toothache? Try kissing a donkey. Yes, that was a real remedy. Headache? Tie a dead mole to your head. The truly amusing treatments involved wearing various animal parts around your neck, from dried frogs to fox teeth. It was like medieval jewelry, just grosser and smellier. A popular cure for rheumatism was carrying a potato in your pocket until it rotted. At least that one was relatively harmless. Archaeologists studying medieval bones have found that some peasants actually survived brain surgery. They've discovered skulls with perfectly round holes that had healed over, indicating the patient lived for years afterward. The success rate was around 80%, which is quite impressive considering they were essentially drilling holes in people's heads with hand tools. They called this procedure tree panning, and some individuals actually volunteered for it to treat headaches or epilepsy. When the Black Death struck in 1348, things became particularly grim. Doctors devised various bizarre protective measures, including distinctive beak-shaped masks filled with herbs. These resembled frightening bird costumes, but the herbs did offer some benefit, with some possessing natural antiseptic properties. Not that this helped much against the plague, but at least they smelled pleasant while fleeing from infected individuals. Some towns attempted to combat the plague by banishing cats, which unfortunately worsened the situation as rats multiplied without natural predators. Women often served as healers in peasant communities, and they were quite skilled. They knew which herbs could alleviate pain, promote wound healing, or reduce fevers. Archaeological evidence indicates many women healers kept detailed records of their treatments and success rates. However, there was a caveat. If they were too successful at healing, they risked being accused of witchcraft. Talk about a challenging performance review. Medieval surgery was essentially like carpentry, but performed on people. Most surgeons were also barbers. Yes, truly. This is why barber poles are red and white, representing blood and bandages. They operated by the motto, fast is good, faster is better, because anesthesia was non-existent, except for alcohol and perhaps a stick to bite on. Archaeological evidence suggests some surgeons could amputate a limb in under 3 minutes. They even had specialties. Some barber surgeons were known specifically for removing bladder stones, which they could apparently do in under 2 minutes. But it wasn't all bad. They did have some smart ideas. Honey was used as an antiseptic on wounds, and it actually worked. Modern science has confirmed honey's natural antibacterial properties. They also applied moldy bread to infections, inadvertently discovering penicillin about 800 years before Alexander Fleming. Some healers even developed remarkable skill at setting broken bones. Archaeologists have found medieval skeletons with perfectly healed fractures. Despite all these challenges, medieval peasants were not significantly shorter-lived than people in ancient Rome. If one survived childhood, there was a reasonable chance of reaching 60 or 70. Perhaps there is something to be said for kissing donkeys after all. However, maintaining health wasn't solely about medicine. It also involved enjoyment. And medieval peasants certainly knew how to celebrate in ways that would make modern festival-goers seem tame. Amidst all the demanding work and unconventional medical treatments, these individuals definitely knew how to unwind. The medieval calendar featured approximately 50 holidays per year, significantly more than we have today. While most were religious festivals, medieval people transformed nearly any excuse into a celebration. Take May Day, for example. This wasn't just an ordinary spring celebration. It was akin to a combination of a large music festival, a carnival, and a village-wide dating event. Young people would engage in Maying in the woods, which essentially involved sneaking off to flirt, while others danced around the maypole. Fun fact, some maypoles were so tall they had to be permanently erected in the village green. One record from 1343 mentions a maypole in London that exceeded the height of the local church steeple. The church was not entirely pleased with these celebrations. Numerous records document priests complaining about ungodly behavior during May Day festivities. Medieval sports were intense. Football wasn't played on a designated field with clear rules. It was played throughout the entire village with hundreds of participants and virtually no regulations other than getting the ball to your team's end of town. Records show entire villages being banned from playing due to the number of broken windows. One game in 1280 resulted in 3 deaths in a burned-down house. This makes modern soccer hooligans seem rather subdued. They also played a brutal game called cock-throwing, where you attempted to hit a rooster with sticks. Thankfully, that particular sport did not survive into modern times. Music was omnipresent in medieval life. There was no need for elaborate instruments. People created music with whatever was available. Spoons, pots, even bones served as instruments. Archaeological digs have uncovered numerous medieval flutes, such as small clay horses and wooden swords. They've even found medieval baby bottles crafted from cow horns. Scientists analyzing these bottles discovered traces of milk proteins, indicating they were used for feeding infants. The roles of men and women were quite defined, but with some surprising exceptions. Women could own businesses. Records show female brewers, bakers, and even blacksmiths. One village had a woman who was the official rat catcher. She was reportedly so effective that other villages attempted to hire her away. Analysis of medieval tax records indicates that in some towns, up to 30% of businesses were owned by women. Marriage for women wasn't always permanent either. While divorce didn't exist, couples could obtain an annulment if they could prove their marriage was invalid. Some of the excuses were astonishing. One man claimed his marriage should be annulled because his wife was excessively fond of cheese. Another claimed his wife was a witch because their chickens stopped laying eggs after they married. Church courts heard thousands of such cases. Some estimates suggest about 5% of medieval marriages ended in annulment. However, despite all the rules and arrangements, medieval people still found ways to follow their hearts. Court records are full of stories about couples who eloped, secret marriages, and romantic gestures. One man faced trouble for stealing flowers from the Lord's garden to give to his beloved. Another carved love poems into a church wall. They are still visible today. Archaeologists have even discovered love letters written on pieces of bark and concealed in walls. Speaking of the church, it played a massive role in everyone's life, not just concerning marriage. And believe me, when it came to medieval religion, things became exceptionally interesting. The church exerted a firm grip on medieval peasant life, coupled with a persistent demand for contributions. For peasants, religion was not merely a weekly activity, it influenced virtually every moment of their existence. And indeed, it significantly depleted their already limited financial resources. Peasants were required to give the church a tithe, which meant 1/10 of everything they produced. Harvest of 10 eggs, one went to the church. 10 apples, same arrangement. 10 bags of grain, yes, the church received one. For peasants who often had barely enough to subsist on, this constituted a heavy burden. Records indicate the average peasant family surrendered about 10% of their crops to the church, in addition to payments owed to their lord. But that wasn't all. They had to pay extra for any necessary church service. Once your baby baptized, there was a fee. Getting married? Better save up some grain. Even death wasn't free. Families had to scrape together payment for funeral services. One peasant's diary from 1324 complains that his family had to sell their only cow to cover his father's funeral expenses. The church calendar also dictated when peasants could work. Besides Sundays, there were saints' days, feast days, and special celebrations when labor was forbidden. This sounds appealing until you realize no work meant no food, yet you were still required to give the church its share. Court records document peasants being fined for attempting to harvest on holy days, even when rain threatened to ruin their crops. One desperate farmer was caught picking peas on St. Mark's Day. His fine was twice the pea's value. However, they developed a clever blend of Christianity and traditional folk beliefs to help them cope. A peasant might attend church in the morning, then secretly visit the local wise woman for a blessing on their crops in the afternoon. Archaeological excavations in peasant homes have found Christian crosses buried alongside good luck charms made from herbs and bones. They were covering all their spiritual bases. For peasants, anything that might help their crops grow was worth trying. The local priest held significant power over peasants' daily lives. He could refuse them the sacraments, which they believed were necessary for salvation, if they failed to pay their dues or behaved improperly. Records show one priest who wouldn't baptize a peasant's baby until the family paid an old church debt with interest. However, some priests were more understanding. Manor court rolls mention a priest who accepted labor in the church gardens instead of money from the poorest families. For peasants, the church building itself was a constant drain on their resources. They were required to help maintain it for free, providing labor and materials in addition to their regular work. One village account shows peasants spending 6 weeks rebuilding a church wall. 6 weeks they couldn't work their own land, but they had no alternative. Refusing to help could result in excommunication, meaning being completely cut off from the community. The fear of eternal damnation was a potent tool used to keep peasants in line. Church paintings depicted peasants being tortured in hell for transgressions like stealing food or missing mass. Records from peasant trials show individuals confessing to minor crimes out of terror of dying with unconfessed sins. One peasant woman admitted stealing a loaf of bread 20 years earlier because she feared for her soul. However, medieval peasants devised clever ways to manage these religious demands. They would make bargains with saints, promising future payment if the saint would provide help in the present. They would share the cost of religious services among families. Some would even time their confessions for after the harvest, when they had more to offer. Court records reveal one group of peasants who rotated church attendance. Each family sent one person to represent them all, sharing the burden of the time commitment. Examining all these records, court cases, and archaeological findings highlights the remarkable creativity and resilience of medieval peasants. They found ways to navigate their beliefs, bend the rules when necessary, and somehow maintain their spirits throughout it all. Their relationship with the church perfectly encapsulates what it meant to be a medieval peasant. Life was incredibly difficult, but they consistently found ways to persevere. Perhaps in that sense, they weren't so different from people today, simply trying to navigate life's complexities while ensuring sustenance and maintaining hope.